Okay, so the first evening of Home Improvements, the Basics, previously known as Retrofit Basics, the Beginner's Guide to Retrofit, with me and Steve from the Centre for Sustainable Energy. Okay. Oh, and I have press record, so that's good. So firstly, starting off with the organisation itself. So Steve and I work for the Centre for Sustainable Energy, and at CSE, our goal is to support people and organisations across the UK with a dual goal of tackling the climate emergency and ending the suffering of cold homes. So we've got three teams. We have a energy advice team who focus on individual advice to householders about keeping warm and keeping their energy bills down. We also have a research team who make open source tools for people looking to learn more about heat networks and renewable technologies in their area. And we have a community engagement team, which is Steve and myself. Steve, I think this part is you.
Okay, just to point out, the community engagement team is not just me and Kate. Um, so yeah, this is sort of to give you an overview of principles and what's involved and some of the things we all need to think about. We will talk through pros and cons of different bits, but this won't be sort of detailed advice for your house. It's I mean, we'll come on to that, but yeah, and it's not going to replace the advice of a qualified professional that's looked at your home. It probably won't make you an expert, but hopefully it will give you yeah, some of the basic considerations.
Yeah. And after the online materials, so we've got these 3 units over 3 evenings, we'll have a downloadable like home energy survey that you can take to look around your house. And Steve and I are going to lots of Green Open Home or Green Open Home adjacent events in the next few months. So you're very welcome to come to an event and ask us questions. And some of our events will be going around homes and looking at issues that we're going to be talking about over the next 3 weeks. So today we're starting with Unit 1. What is retrofit? Why is retrofit important? Key principles. So that's where Steve really gets to take the wheel and run away with the details. Um, we might discuss some of the challenges and controversies in the field and conclude with the key things to remember from this evening. And Steve, I've just realized that I don't have the seeing the notes function because I'm recording on my screen. So please do butt in if I've forgotten something as I'm speaking.
No problem.
Great. Thanks, Warren, for joining us as well. All right. I think this might be you, Steve.
Hey, so what is retrofit? I mean, if anybody wants to unmute and have a shout out, have a guess. Um, some people think it's a very technical thing. Anybody?
I would be interested to know if people have generally heard of the phrase retrofit before or if it feels like something they don't know very much about.
Converting an existing property.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's pretty much bang on what we have here.
Yeah, it just means doing work to an existing building. Um, Try and make it more energy efficient, basically. Uh, yeah, it can include repair and maintenance, renewable technology, insulation stuff, heating systems, and much, much more. So,
Yeah. When Steve and I have been doing our community events, it seems that some people hear the word retrofit and immediately think heat pumps, and that's the main thing that they think of. But that's not just it. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Hannah. No worries about the noise. That's fine. So, in an ideal world, a good retrofit reduces your energy use and your consumption of carbon. So it's good for your bills, also good for the planet, and improves your health and comfort as well, ideally. I mean, that is what you aim to do. But poor retrofit, and there's been quite a lot of press about poor retrofit at the moment because of government insulation schemes that are having varying results. Poor retrofit means failing to realize the savings, either the energy savings or financial savings or carbon savings. And it can lead to increased damp, mold, fire risk, overheating, damaging our buildings, and damaging our heritage. So, Steve and I, in our projects, we do focus specifically on older buildings and traditional buildings. So that's a consideration for us. I think I might have that news article in this
I think
slide
you do.
next. Yeah. Oh yes, yeah. This was a favorite of mine. This is an example of for retrofit that was in the news recently. But why, Steve? Why should we do it?
So why retrofit? Yes, well, hopefully most of you are aware we're in a bit of a situation with our climate. Um, so ideally, we should stop knocking down buildings and building new because construction is particularly bad for the planet. We tend to use a lot of materials. There's a lot of heavily processed materials. We tend to make a lot of waste, and we're just quite wasteful in construction. So if possible, yeah, let's try and keep our buildings, but sort of make them fit for the future and a bit more resilient, as our climate does change. And yeah, we've got a bit here about carbon emissions in buildings. So lots of people with sort of retrofit stuff and energy efficiency stuff tend to think about what we call operational carbon. But when we look at this slide, you can see actually the operational bit is actually only part of it. So a bit like that last slide was sort of trying to communicate. We've got extraction, raw materials, we've got manufacturing, the actual construction, we've got the repair and maintenance. But then at the end of this, we've got the demolition and disposal. So that's why we try to encourage people to think about something known as whole life carbon, which includes embodied, operational, and disposal.
I think there's some more examples of that in the next slide. Oh yeah.
Yeah, so here, yeah, we always need to think about what is the carbon cost, what can we do? We do a lot of work with traditional buildings and listed buildings. And I suppose it's that thing on the left, you've got an old wooden window there. So I suppose it's thinking about, do we need to rip it out and send it to landfill? Can we repair it? Can we improve it with something like secondary glazing? We need to think about how long things are going to last. And that image on the right there is just looking at some of the waste that comes out of construction and comes out of even retrofit. There's a particular point about materials and things that are often sort of advertised as little or low or no maintenance, when certainly with plastic windows, it often means that you can't actually maintain them. So it's just something to be aware of. So yeah, we need to think a bit more holistically around the subject of retrofit and energy efficiency.
Hmm. And that's why we bring this up so early on in the training, just because it is kind of foundational information. And in the next session, next Tuesday night, we'll talk more about specific measures, like for example, double glazed windows, triple glazed windows, and have a bit of discussion around the pros and cons of installing new measures versus the embodied carbon of those new measures that you're putting in. Did you have anything else you wanted to add on this slide, Steve?
I'm just looking at my notes. No, I think that's it.
Hmm.
So yeah, this is um, lots of people tend to sort of say our old buildings are old, damp, leaky, inefficient, and we should just sort of knock them down and build new ones. And I suppose the environmental point around that is actually lots of our buildings, I think it's 80% of our buildings are thought to already be built. That I've said that wrong, sorry. 80% of our buildings in 2050 are thought to already be built. So we can, I don't know, argue or try and get people to consider that the most sustainable building is one that is already built. Um, so yeah, trying to keep them and trying to improve them. That's why we retrofit.
Hmm. And I realized, Steve, we forgot to say at the start your background and why you are a particular proponent of buildings that are already built.
Okay. I'm
Can
a heritage builder by background, so I am a qualified retrofit coordinator, and I also have my master's degree in sustainability and adaptation in the built environment. So I've given this quite a bit of thought over the years, and I've done a lot of actual work on buildings. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
kind of your jam. And I have been working in community engagement with the Center for Sustainable Energy, but I am fairly new to this stuff with Steve, so I might be asking just as many questions as everyone else as we go along.
So climate change and retrofit. Again, I suppose traditionally with retrofit, people tend to think about improving operational energy efficiency in the winter. But we try to encourage people to think a bit more broadly than that. As our climate is changing, we also need to think about things like flood prevention. We are having more things like wind-driven rain, increased rainfall. I'm sure we've all seen that recently with some of the storms. That's also led to flooding. But then on the flip side of that, we're also getting overheating. I know some of us um, don't think about that in the UK, and it doesn't happen very often. But when it does, it does actually cause what's known as excess summer deaths, the same way that we get excess winter deaths when people are too cold. Um, and we are seeing increased relative humidity, and with that, that tends to encourage more mold growth. So yeah, it's not just about energy efficiency in winter. We do need to sort of think about the whole year with our buildings.
Hmm. With specifically with reference to things that are already happening because of climate change. Um, I really like these maps, Steve. These maps really pulled it together for me when you spoke about this the first time. So on the left-hand side is a map of the severity of wind-driven rain in the UK. So that's rain coming through from storms. So rain that is coming from the side of your house, hitting the side of your house rather than the top of your house. And that's why it's so important to retrofit because our buildings are becoming more damp on their walls rather than, just running down the gutters from your roof. And so the dark blue areas are the areas of higher severity. Although this map doesn't consider, you could be in a higher severity, more severe area, but your house itself could be quite sheltered, so that wouldn't affect you.
Yeah, and on
Similarly,
the
yeah,
yeah, now go on, you
no,
finish.
vice versa. Yeah.
Yeah, you can be in a fairly sort of sheltered location, but be on top of a mountain, for example.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And the fact that this map also comes from the building regulations documents, but that means that it comes from research from several decades ago and is probably quite outdated already when it comes to the severity of wind-driven rain in the UK. Yeah. And then did you have something else you wanted to add to that, Steve?
No.
So then on the right-hand side rather, um, this is a map of the it's a screenshot of the annual flood levels in North Somerset. So the areas in red are areas that would expect to flood once a year in North Somerset. So we would expect the red patches to be growing as our seas get a bit warmer and rise a bit more in
The
North Somerset.
flooding one, and I think the flooding maps are a bit tricky sometimes because they don't always consider, or a lot of the times they have caveats where they say, well, there is actually flood defences here, but I suppose it's
Mm,
just making sure that we understand the need to sort of repair, maintain our flood defences so they do actually work. And um, yeah, we're working a lot in North Somerset at the moment, so places like Clevedon, when we're doing research, there's lots of areas that flood, and I know I think last week there was issues with yeah, flooding, so it's just something to keep in mind.
mm. And all this is more reason why we should be doing retrofit. Um, oh, Steve, you were talking about heating in houses being something that we don't really think about in the UK.
Yeah, so the image on the right here, that's another image that's actually within building regulations, and I think that's looking at London. Um, because cities suffer from something that's called the urban heat island, because they don't get the same amount of wind and sort of don't know, ventilation, I suppose. So yeah, it can be particularly bad. I think you can get local data for this, but it's just something we need to be increasingly more aware of. So yeah, that's why we just like to make people aware.
Yeah, and especially relevant in I guess, a political climate or funding climate where insulation is something that people are eager to give grant funding for people who live in areas of deprivation. But if we insulate all of our homes, we do need to still consider overheating. So this side with retrofit and social justice, it does relate to what we've been saying so far, but essentially, as we transition away from fossil fuels, retrofit can be part of a socially just transition away from fossil fuels in when it's good retrofit, because good retrofit should reduce bills, which is tackling fuel poverty. It should therefore improve people's health because we know that cold homes are cause misery and poor health for people. The retrofit industry is also a place that is booming and will continue to boom in skills and education and jobs for people. So it's a lot of opportunity in that field. And it also builds pride of place to look after the buildings that we have. So for these reasons, retrofit's great for adapting to climate impacts and also hopefully contributes to leveling the playing field a little bit more. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Steve?
No, you good. Um,
So this is kind of the meat of tonight's presentation, really. We're going to go through these 5 key retrofit principles, which are like basic retrofit principles, and give you a bit more information on each one.
yeah, so the first one, I don't know, sometimes surprises people, but I like to think of it a bit like first aid. And I know one of the things with first aid is first do no harm. I think we always try to encourage people to start from a position of knowledge and do a bit of learning about the building that you're in or the building that you're going to retrofit. I appreciate, people talk about climate emergency and there's a tendency to want to do everything very, very quickly, but we do need to understand what we're doing before we rush ahead and do it. So it's, yeah, about starting with some knowledge, assessing the risk before we get carried away.
I know I said that I can't read my notes from here, Steve, but I remember there's a line in there that
Ah,
retrofitting your
no,
home isn't rocket science, but it
but it is
is.
thermodynamics and
It,
building physics, yes.
yeah,
So that's, yeah,
we'll talk about that
thermodynamic,
next week. Yeah.
yeah, we will. Very good.
Yeah, we will talk a lot about moisture and mold next week.
So, lots of people don't sort of think that repair and maintenance is part of retrofit, but it really is. I mean, if we retrofit homes that are not in a good condition and haven't been repaired and maintained, then there's a chance that our work won't work. And also after we've done retrofit, we still need to do repair and maintenance because there's a chance then that um, the work that we have done then gets undermined. So I know there's been quite a lot of studies around this. It can actually massively reduce the operational emissions of a building. So yeah, don't overlook it. I think that's the key message.
Hmm. And we'll have lots of examples of that next week. But yeah, if you're gonna put in new stuff, make sure the old stuff's working well first.
Energy efficiency. So forgive me if this sounds a bit complicated, but there's something called Jevons paradox, and it was a guy a very long time ago, I think in 1865, noted that as we improve the efficiency of stuff, what actually happens is we tend to just consume things quicker. Um, so it's definitely something worth thinking about because I suppose as a society, energy efficiency and efforts to improve it have been around for a long time, but we've never actually reduce the amount of energy we're using. I think that's what that image on the right there shows, that actually we just keep it consuming more and more and more and more. So it's certainly something to bear in mind. Um, and it's not just economists that argue for this. I've met lots of people that work in the conservation world, that maybe we need to be looking at energy sufficiency as opposed to efficiency. But I'll let other people decide that. We do have something called rebound effects. That's where people can retrofit their homes, but then go on lots of long haul flights and end up using more or using more energy, emitting more carbon. Then we have things like pre-bound effects. So we'll talk about this a bit later, but some buildings are not as inefficient as people think. So what can happen is you think you're going to save all this carbon and money on your heating bills. You do the work, but actually it doesn't save as much as we think. So it's just being aware that there are a few sort of pitfalls, I suppose. And a whole house
Apologies.
approach.
Oh, no, go on.
No, no, you go.
Okay, but then you make sure I'm saying it right.
Okay.
Okay, so the whole house approach is really key to good retrofit, and it basically means this is not a one size fits all operation. You need to think about everything that's happening in that house to make it a bespoke approach for a balanced solution for that house. Specifically in this diagram, looking at the services, so that means what's coming in and out of the house, your pipes, your cables, um, internet, that sort of stuff. The fabric of the building, and so the fabric means the walls, the roof, the floors, the outside envelope of your house. So what's that made of? What condition is it in? Um, how old is it? Do you know how long it's been there for? That just as much information about that as you can get. The use of the house. So what is the house being used for? Is it this links quite closely to people, but is it a very large building that just one elderly couple live in, so they don't use many of the rooms, or is it a share house with lots of people living in it and they move in and out quite frequently, so they don't look up, they don't, have time to look after the building, that kind of thing. So what will work well for one building will not work well for another, even if at a general glance they seem quite similar. So by taking a whole house approach, the idea is that this will highlight the uncertainties, but also help you reconcile conflicting aims. So if you want to save carbon by um, doing a lot of retrofit work, maybe if there's only a handful of people living there and they actually don't have very high energy bills already, then you can focus on something else. And in this way, you hopefully also manage the unintended consequences. And that ties back to the do no harm. So once you know more about how the building is used, what are the services, what's the fabric, what is the makeup of the people that live there, it will help you to do no harm as well. So I think this is maybe the first and most important thing that I learned when I started learning about retrofit.
Yeah. Sorry, just to add, it
Yeah.
is a balance. It really is a balance. And I think people are really key in this as well because people tend to work on our buildings. So there's also that element of it there as well.
Yeah. And you might
Yeah.
not know what people have done before
Yeah.
in your building. So when it comes to knowing what is going on in your building, assessments and monitoring are the key way that you can find out more about how your building is used. Um, what is the air quality in your house? What is the humidity in your house? What is the condition of the insulation that's been in your walls for 30 years? All of that comes back to assessments and monitoring. Um, so, for example, an assessment that you might have heard of, that hopefully you've heard of, is an EPC certificate. So every home should have an EPC certificate if it's recently been bought or being rented out. And that's one example of an assessment that will give you an indication of how energy efficient your house is. But we'll talk a little bit more about EPCs here. Steve, do you want to talk
and
about
I
this
know
one?
this. I know this slide always.
This
Some of my
slide's very
colleagues.
controversial.
Yes, it is very controversial because lots of people tend to get taught this. Oh, every house loses 25% through the walls and whatever, whatever. But I suppose it's just really trying to hammer home the point that all of our homes are different, and whilst they may look similar, you might have a neighbor that lives in a house that was built at a similar time to you, particularly if they're older buildings. They've probably been worked on very differently over the years. Sometimes it's more than 100 years. They will have had different tradesmen using different materials. They might have different heating systems. And again, they all use differently. So I appreciate why people like this image, but it frustrates me a little bit because it makes everybody think that, oh, my house loses this and my house loses that through the windows. And it's not quite that simple, unfortunately. So I think the next image um,
This
actually
is Steve's
shows,
preferred image.
yeah, this is, so the size of the pie charts are all different because all of our homes are different. But actually the breakdown of the energy use in all of those pie charts is even different again. So it's just trying to be a bit more nuanced with this. And yeah, get us to think, well, my house will lose less heat if I've got loft insulation, whereas my neighbour doesn't have loft insulation. So that 25% figure might not be appropriate there. So it really does come back to that whole house approach. And yeah. Okay, assessments and monitoring. So I know Kate's just mentioned EPCs. Um, has anybody, well, I'm guessing a lot of you might have EPCs on your house. Has anybody looked at the recommendations that they've done? No?
There's a
Any
few
volunteer?
people that have to type in the chat, so maybe
Right,
give
okay.
them a
Yeah,
second.
sometimes yeah, certainly not on older houses, but the like more recent houses I've had them done, and yeah, it seems a bit wishy-washy sometimes, but
Hmm.
Yeah, I think I understand why lots of people like them because they try to sort of provide a very easy overview of comparing our houses. Um, but they tend to overlook a few things. So they tend not to consider the condition of a building. So if a building is damp, it's not reflected within the EPC. If a building is in a poor state of repair, that's not reflected in an EPC. Um, and as Kate was talking about before, we use our homes differently. So if you've got an elderly couple uh, living in a house and then they move out and a young couple with lots of kids move in, that house is going to use energy in a very different way, and that's not reflected within an EPC. So they're quite blunt. And I know there's lots of work going on, and they're always trying to change how they calculate the stuff. And yeah, it's actually quite difficult to do it properly. But I suppose more recently, there's been developments where people have been figuring out better ways to measure heat loss in buildings and actually look at how much energy we're actually consuming. Um, and this image here sort of shows that quite nicely. So all these different bars, they represent different houses. And this is drawn from lots of different studies, but what we actually find is the actual measured energy can be very, very different from the calculated energy that's used in an EPC. Um, and with older buildings, what has been found is older buildings actually, if they're in a good condition, that's a big thing. And if repair and maintenance has been done, they can actually be a lot more efficient than what the EPC suggests. And newer buildings, they can often be not as efficient as the EPC suggests. And again, it's just because of what's not considered. They're not, how they're built, what condition they're in, how they're used. So yeah, it's just basically be a bit careful with your EPC. Um, yeah.
Hmm. And then I guess it does tie back into the question of energy efficiency and if your goal is being really energy efficient, then the fact that your EPC is fairly bluntly measured is an issue. But if your goal is more related to cutting your bills or making your home healthy and comfortable for your family, then maybe your retrofit aims will be slightly different and that won't matter to you.
Yeah, and it's like back to that damp and mold stuff. I mean, if you've got damp mold in your house, it doesn't matter what your EPC says. You've got damp and mold in your house, and you
Yeah,
want to sort of try and deal with that.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ah, fabric
So,
first.
has anybody heard of Fabric First?
Oh, yes, that's a good question. You could give us a reaction if you
Thumbs
have
up for
heard.
yes, a thumbs down for no.
I'm not hearing much on the wavelengths. Okay, this is really interesting for Steve and I because Fabric First has been, thank you, Donna. Fabric First is been what, like a mantra, a slogan, a buzz phrase in the retrofit world for years. And to the point where now there's all this myth busting around what Fabric First should mean and what it shouldn't mean. And we as a community engagement team felt like, oh, we need to make sure that people know what it really means. But if no one's heard of it in the first place, does it really matter?
Yes, so talking to that, it's I suppose in the retrofit industry and what retrofit people get taught, everybody gets drummed into them Fabric First. And there's something called the energy hierarchy where it sort of says, make your fabric of your building as efficient as possible before you fit a heat pump, before you get solar panels. And people have been insisting on this for a very long time. But then now there's a sort of counter argument to that to say, well, actually, at the rate that people are insulating their buildings, it'll take hundreds of years before we get down to being able to put in a heat pump. And as we talked about in the last slide, where we were looking at measuring energy use in buildings, it's really quite interesting that once we start to measure the energy use, we can discover that actually lots of our buildings are actually suitable for heat pumps now. And by insisting on doing all this work to a building fabric, it's actually preventing people from switching to low carbon heating, which is really what we want to encourage. And yeah, so I suppose, yeah, we wanted to just talk about this a tiny bit. It's one of those things that in an ideal world, you probably wouldn't need to know it. But it will come up. People do tend to talk about it, and lots of people are quite militant and insist on it. But I suppose we like to just be a bit more nuanced with it. So I think what we've agreed that it does mean is do assess your building fabric before you start doing things. Do make targeted improvements where safe, appropriate, and practically possible. So things like loft insulation, if you haven't done it, it's a good idea to do it. But it doesn't mean that we need to cover all of our buildings in polystyrene before you can fit a heat pump. So yeah, just wanted to clear that up.
Oh, did you want that video, Steve? I forgot there was a video in there.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Yeah, did the video? Can you hear that noise, Steve? Is the sound coming through?
I can't hear anything, no.
Okay. Let me just share the sound. Okay.
I had a heat loss survey done approximately a year ago because I wanted
Third time's a charm.
to know whether a heat pump would be appropriate for this particular house. And I think it's a complex area that I need a lot of advice in, and it seems to me that the heat loss survey is the most important part of that. And they sent down 2 engineers who were going to measure how much heat was being lost from the building. When they got into the process, essentially they put up a series of heaters in every room. They switched them up to 25 degrees overnight, and at midnight they switched them all off, and they measured the amount of heat loss through the walls in every room. That gave us what they called a thermal coefficient, which was basically how much energy is being lost through the walls and the roof of the house. It came out at the order of 7 kilowatts worth of energy, suggesting to us that a heat pump would have to put in 7 kilowatts in order to maintain an even temperature. And it was surprising how low that was compared with what I had expected. Thanks to an engagement with a local organisation called SUSWAT, or Sustainable Westbourne-Trim, I've been finding a great deal about heat pumps, reading up about them and trying to find out what is best for this particular house. The journey is a significant one, and it is not right for all people at this time. I think it's about getting advice. It's essential to have a heat loss survey done in most houses. Wherever there is an older or quirkier house, it's particularly important. For me, it's critical that it has happened to make sure you get the right size of heat pump in the right properties.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Kate. That was taken from a project that we worked on last year, and I think at the time we did a lot of community engagement, knocking on lots of people's doors, and everybody seemed to be saying, "No, I can't have a heat pump. I've not insulated all my walls, and I've not done this, and I've not done that." And yeah, it's quite interesting that when you start measuring heat loss, it can quite often change your perspective a bit. And turns out that heat pumps are suitable for old buildings, and they're suitable for lots of buildings. So yeah, don't rule them out.
And we talk more about heat pumps next week when we talk about different measures that you could install in your home. But yeah, it very much ties into fabric first. That's like when it all gets brought up, when the heat pumps come into the conversation.
Hey,
All right.
no, you go.
Oh, you're okay. Okay, I'll do this one. So we've mentioned it several times about traditional versus modern building fabric. And we will talk about this more next week because, like we said, damp and mold is a big one for next week, and this links to that. But essentially, a traditionally built stone wall, which is on the left here, allows for moisture to evaporate. So the stones in the wall absorb some of the moisture from the rain, from the ground. Also, if you're creating moisture inside your house, the solid stone wall will absorb some of that, and then it dries out because the wind whips past it and the water evaporates. And that's what the arrows in the picture are showing. This is a completely different method of managing moisture to a modern building with a cavity wall. So it's a modern building with a cavity wall is more like a waterproof envelope, and we're trying to keep the outside wall completely out and the inside wall completely in. And so the gap between the two walls with a cavity in between, that keeps the internal wall dry, and the external wall is the only part that gets wet and then dries out. And if you're creating moisture inside your building, then you will also have a extractor fan or other mechanical or passive flue or vent out of your house to get moisture from your kitchen or your bathroom out of the waterproof membrane. And so you'll have a damp-proof coursing on the floor as well. So both of these methods, great methods, they work quite well until we put modern waterproof materials onto our traditional stone walls.
It's not just traditional stone. There's lots. So I've done lots of building with mud and earth buildings, and might be surprising. There's quite a few in the UK. But generally, if you've got what is called lime mortar, so that's the bit that sort of everybody thinks sticks all your bricks and your stones together. If you've got lime mortar, then that means it's what's called vapor permeable, so it can, as Kate said, it will get wet. And I suppose for any of you that are in North Somerset or by the coast, lots of our older traditional buildings tend to have really big, thick stone walls. And the idea was that they will probably get a bit wet when it's really really rainy, got lots of wind-driven rain, lots of sea spray from the ocean. But because the walls are so thick, it shouldn't get all the way through. And as we're heating our homes on the inside and as the wind comes past on the outside, hopefully the walls dry out again. But as Kate was just touching on there, the problems tend to come over the years because somebody's come along, they've removed the old lime mortar render or lime pointing, and they've replaced it with modern cement renders, which tend to be harder and they tend to be a bit more waterproof. And there's lots of people around there selling injected damp-proof courses. But what tends to happen when we get things like broken tiles or our rainwater guds are leaking, lots of moisture can come into the wall, and because it's now covered in a more waterproof material, it quite often stays in the wall. So there's lots of damp walls out there. So yeah, this is just sort of trying to make people aware of the difference between modern buildings and traditional buildings. They do sort of work quite fundamentally differently. So yeah, just trying to raise a bit of awareness of that.
Hmm. And how would someone know what kind of building that they had, Steve?
If you've got really big, thick walls, then tends to be solid walls. Not always true. Generally older homes, lots of people say pre-1919. Some people say pre-Second World War. It's more what the building's built from, and lime mortar is one of the key bits because that's the sort of the vapor permeable bit. So yeah, there's lots of stone houses out there, brick houses out there, different ones. Whereas if you've got a more modern house, I think since the sort of 70s and 80s, as we started to have lots of cavity walls with insulation in them, they are quite different and they do function quite different.
Hmm. We'll have more room for questions at the end about that if anyone's got questions.
Well, I mean, if you want to ask questions now, does anybody live in a traditional building?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And that's one of the things I'm really interested in is, like, and maybe that will be covered next week, is things like external cladding and what effect that would have and what the considerations are. So I suspect that's covered next week. But yeah.
Mm.
Yep. Okay. Good. Do you know, is your building covered with cement?
No, I think, well, certainly because my parents have been there 40 years.
Okay.
I think and the builder I know they've been using more recently definitely has been using traditional sort of
Okay.
lime and not concrete renders, but I couldn't guarantee it.
Yeah, okay. No, I always find that really interesting because, yeah, if you've lived in an old building for a long time, I think the last time we did this webinar, there was a lady talking, and she was explaining how, yes, she had a builder, they came in, they injected a damp-proof course, they covered it with cement, and it didn't work. And then years later, she had to do a bit of learning and remove everything that had been done. So yeah, I think that's why we say about learn a bit about your building first and try to understand what you've got and how it works. Right. Okay. So yeah, I think you'll hear us talk a lot about balancing and risk management. Um, so yeah, there is a lot to think about, unfortunately. It'd be nice if this was simpler. Um, but yeah, there's risk to everything that we do. There's also things like disruption we need to think of, the lifespan of what we're doing. There's practical considerations, particularly when you start looking at wall insulation and things like that. There's the environmental impact of the things that we're using, particularly sort of a tricky balance with things like UPVC windows, because obviously they are fossil fuel derived, and a lot of our insulation materials that we use are derived from fossil fuels, so that's also something to think about. Then we do have our heritage considerations, and then obviously there's the cost, and it says there both financial and carbon. But then we've got lots of benefits as well. So there's the upskilling people and the job creation. Kate mentioned before that pride of place, reducing overheating and just being, yeah, more conscious of things like that. Improve quality of life. I think Kate spoke about the misery of damp and cold homes. Well, that's the next bit. Reduce our energy bills and reduce our emissions. So there are Lots of pros, lots of cons, and lots to keep in mind.
And half of those are the same on both sides. The costs and the bills and the carbon emissions can be a risk and a benefit.
Where have we gone here?
I think this might be one of the last things, just as like a final, again, avoid undermining your interventions. Retrofit is not fit and forget. Maintain, repair.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and it's interesting, Warren, you asked about things like wall insulation and stuff. I mean, it's one of those things. I've seen it on buildings where they've covered the wall with insulation, but then the gutters have leaked and the walls have got wet, and the insulation then is adding to the problem. It's not helping with the problem. So it's just making sure that we don't overlook things like repair and maintenance, because it really, really is very important. And I suppose I've recently done some training with a thermal imaging drone, and the guy that was teaching us was a former pilot, and he was drilling into us the importance of planned preventative maintenance, because obviously with an aeroplane you can't just not do that, fly, and then something breaks when you're in midair, and yeah, it causes lots of problems. So it's actually about having things like maintenance plans. How often do we clean our gutters? Do we go out and have a look at them when it's raining? Are they leaking? Um, so yeah, don't overlook repair and maintenance is a key message.
This is the end. This is the conclusion of all the content we've just run over, and then there's a few more slides about what we're doing, what you could do next, what's happening next week. Yada yada yada. I
Are
feel like
you going to
Stephen.
talk through this?
Yeah, and then you can butt in.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So, like we said, climate change has local and global impacts, but the local ones are a big deal, and we need to adapt our buildings in the face of a changing climate to be resilient. So, thinking about the wind-driven rain, overheating, flood risks, increased humidity.
Yeah, and they're all very specific. I think that's why I suppose a national approach to retrofit is a bit tricky, because we all live in different places, different buildings, in slightly different locations. So we do need to try and put it in a local context as well.
Mm. And then to go even more local, considering the whole use and the whole life of your building, doing a bespoke approach for your building is good retrofit, and good retrofit will make your building more better suited to a changing climate, and hopefully also reduce your bills and make your home a healthier home as well. But it is important to consider the carbon cost, the durability, and the longevity of the materials used in retrofits. And lastly, very importantly, don't forget about repairs.